And welcome back, class, to the True and Accurate History of Polynesia, Part 2. When we left off, Kamehameha the Pious was concentrating on expansion and cultural superiority, as well as sending exploratory missions out into the oceans around the world. So far, things were progressing smoothly for the young Polynesian Empire. Bandits and barbarians continued to plague their shores, and in response, Kamehameha ordered the beginning of a new defensive technique. Rather than building weapons along the coastlines, instead they would build idols to their gods. These they called the moai. It was around this time they also made first contact with the French, led by Napoleon Bonaparte. It was indeed an age of discovery. Many new friends, allies, and possible enemies would be met within the next 200 years. An open borders treaty was negotiated with Bonaparte, mostly so that Kamehameha's ships could continue their explorations of the world around them. The first moai were completed in 1680, near the city of Honolulu, the capital of the empire. This, Kamehameha believed, would help ward off the barbarian attacks that continued to plague them. The stern faces of the moai were sure to scare away the barbarian hordes. At the same time, a theocracy was founded, and Kamehameha was declared a living god. This was great for Kamehameha, as it gave him literally unlimited power to order around his people and tell them exactly what he wanted them to do without being questioned. After all, the will of Kamehameha was the will of the gods. Wu Zetian of Great China was the next country ambassador to be met, and she was friendly enough at first. Things seemed to be pleasant between the Empire of China and the Great Empire of Polynesia. France, of course, continued to simmer silently on the sidelines. The things that would come under Bonaparte's rule remained secret for now. The barbarians continued to attack in the north, and Kamehameha decided that, of course, it was because the moai were scaring the barbarians away in the south. His conclusion was that more needed to be built in order to fully defend his territory from the barbarian attackers, and indeed from any future attackers from across the sea. Even so, Samoa's first frigate, a powerful new breed of warship, proved more than a match for the barbarians' pathetic little galleys. A new age of exploration was upon us, and a new age of expansion and cultural exploration. It was an exciting time for the people of the Polynesian Empire. Banking was discovered, and with banking came the concept of currency. No longer did people have to carry around the weight in gold of anything they wished to purchase. Instead, they could carry around a small coin with Kamehameha's face on one side and a moai head on the other. This coin represented one piece of bread, or 2 fish. Fish were cheaper than bread, because bread required land to grow, and fish grew in the water, and there was plenty of water, and thus plenty of fish. Though, to be honest, Kamehameha's fishing fleet were not exploiting their advantages in the sea as much as they could have, and this would lead to problems in Samoa fairly soon. A new research arrangement began with Askia of the Songhai, and that was an exciting development as well, even as new city-states began to seemingly spring up all over the world. In Samoa, construction continued on the Sistine Chapel, and indeed all resources in Samoa were being directed towards that construction. Kamehameha had decided that it would be a lasting legacy of his greatness should something befall him in the unlikely event that he were removed from power or indeed from life. The Sistine Chapel was seen as a testament to the wonderfully powerful and culturally superiorness of the Polynesian people. National treasury was begun in nearby Tonga, the newest city in the empire, as Kamehameha felt that it needed something to make it feel special. 1775 brought a revolution. Now, instead of merely being a god, Kamehameha decided to hold elections. You had a choice between electing Kamehameha, the living god, or, if you felt like it, you could try to elect Joe, the janitor, in the palace. Kamehameha won with 99.9995% of the votes. Lord Harun al-Rashid of Arabia was the next gentleman to make contact with the Polynesian Empire. Trade didn't seem promising at first, but the amazing wall they had built around their territory was a fascinating geographical or architectural feature, whichever you believed walls were at the time, as some cultures did indeed believe that walls were natural. Here we can see mistakes being made, but that is simply the price of progress. Machinery came to prominence in 1790, and at the same time, Norbert, a great engineer, came to prominence in Honolulu. As there was nothing much for him to do, he was simply set to work, preparing to do something in the future. In other words, he became a student. Time passed in the Polynesian Empire, and things were pleasant, as they generally are, in a culturally focused, island-spanning, island-hopping, ocean-exploring empire, ruled by a benevolent dictator. They kept themselves aloof from the petty squabbles of the city-states who were constantly at each other's throats, and continued their cooperation with Napoleon Bonaparte, at least to an extent, as they stepped into the 19th century, and indeed the future. Honolulu began work on a new structure called the Kremlin. And of course, the Sistine Chapel had been completed in 1815, which allowed the people in Samoa luxuries such as food and shelter and water once again. They were deeply grateful for that, but at the same time they were deeply grateful that the President, King, God, Emperor Kamehameha had blessed their city with his legacy. Mass media began to come to prominence in 1825, and this did not change things over much within the empire, although it did mean that people had to spend a lot more time listening to pundits expounding upon the many virtues of their President, King, God, Emperor Kamehameha. Generally, people didn't mind, as he was taking rather excellent care of them, keeping them happy, and keeping their empire fairly well furnished in terms of money, knowledge, and culture. The moai continued to be built around every coastline of every island that King Kamehameha believed were his own. Everything that he surveyed, of course, he believed would be his eventually, not necessarily through military conquest like the likes of Alexander or Genghis Khan, but rather through the natural recognition of his cultural superiority. And in that great time of incredible confidence, beginning in 1852, yet another golden age dawned, which would last for many years to come. Exploration continued to be one of the main foci of the Polynesian Empire. The constitution that had been adopted in 1775 guaranteed things such as religious freedom to the people of the Polynesian Empire, as well as the right to vote, and elections continued to be held. New candidates came to challenge King Kamehameha, such as Franklin, Jeb, and of course, the well-respected politician and street preacher Jeremiah. Unfortunately, none of them were able to win more than 0.1% of the vote from the general public. President King God Emperor Kamehameha continued to rule and even founded yet another city in a southernmost island, an island which is already inhabited by another culture. This would lead to diplomatic tensions in the future, but at the time, President King God Emperor Kamehameha was not at all concerned about politics or diplomacy. As we mentioned, his arrogance and belief in his innate superiority in every way led to him being fairly confident that no one would ever challenge him in terms of military might. Even so, he did make some small attempts to keep his military up to date, at least in terms of the naval fleet, which remained one of the most impressive in the world. In 1858, as we recently saw, construction began on a great museum in Honolulu, which would house many of the great works of art found in the ruins scattered around the world, as well as those produced in the past by the Polynesian Empire itself. The Inca, as well as the Arabians, formed an alliance of friendship with President King God Emperor Kamehameha. He believed that, of course, this was because of his amazingness, though in reality there were more reasons to this than he believed. Many were diplomatic, some were military, but in the end, Arabia and the Incans simply did not want to get into a fight with an empire as financially powerful and culturally expansive as the Polynesians. As we can see here, the Moai marched proudly along almost every shore, at least in the south, and were beginning to reach to the north as well. New policies continued to be introduced by Kamehameha, or more often his advisors. He found that his taste for politics was pretty much non-existent, although his taste for power and ruling and making pronouncements remained quite impressive. Culture continued to be the main focus. As we can see, opera houses, museums, and of course things which allowed opera houses and museums to be constructed more quickly, such as workshops and windmills, were the primary structures being completed within the Polynesian Empire. The Incans began to rival them for cultural impact, at least in the south, near Tonga and Nukuhiva. President King God Emperor Kamehameha was not pleased by this, but his solution was simply to build more moai, believing that the divine favor that these statues brought him would undoubtedly prove to counter or trump the cultural growth of the Incans, who were, after all, his friends anyway. When we return, we will see the fallout of President King God Emperor Kamehameha's arrogance, and much, much more. So until then, all the best.